Most new watchmakers make this mistake, and it can complicate your service without you even knowing it. Now imagine you've cleaned your parts, you've reassembled the watch, and you've taken your time to do a great job at relubricating. But after you get it all back together, something's not right. So you remove some parts and you do a little troubleshooting. And then, without thinking, you skip this one crucial step. And that misstep is why the watch will never run right. Now, as always in my videos, the goal for the end of this is not just for you to know what the mistake is, but what's more important is for you to understand why it's important not to make it. In a properly serviced watch, each pivot turns in a jewel hole. And each jewel hole has that tiny drop of oil which stays in place by what's called capillary action. And it creates a lubricating film or a bond between the pivot shoulder and the flat side of the jewel. Now, as long as the oil stays in that spot, it provides kind of a cushion between the pivot and the jewel, which reduces friction and wear. If something disturbs that oil bond, that pivot now has to work harder to overcome its friction inside the jewel. Anytime you remove bridges after the pivots have been oiled, it breaks this bond between the pivots and the jewels. That tiny oil droplet is now disturbed and it is never going to work the same. Not only is the bond between the jewel and the pivot shoulder disturbed, but when you pull the pivot out, now oil coats the pivot and it introduces oil where it really just doesn't belong. When you reassemble those parts, now you're just putting a pivot into a jewel that essentially just has oil residue on it. And when you're laying that bridge on, no matter how careful you are, oil is going to get pushed around the jewel by the pivot. I mean, just think about what happens when you put the bridge on and you have to maneuver those pivots around to get them to drop into their hole. That entire time, those pivots are moving that oil all around the jewel itself. Now, once that oil bond is broken, the lubrication cannot simply be left as is. The parts may still look relatively clean, but the oil is no longer going to stay where it needs to be. Those parts have to be re-cleaned and re-lubricated before reassembly. If you reassemble a watch without re-cleaning and reapplying fresh oil, several problems can come up. Now, all these issues may not be immediately obvious, but they will eventually affect the watch's performance as well as the longevity of your service. And whatever you do, don't make this mistake. Some watchmakers will clean the jewels in the pivots with Rodico, but Rodico itself leaves a slight residue that can actually form a pathway for oil to creep away. And this is why many watch brands don't allow the use of Rodico after they do their final cleaning. Any contamination in the oil is going to shorten its effective life. And dirty oil breaks down faster as well as it gums up faster. All right, so let me give you 4 issues that can happen if you don't re-clean and relubricate the parts. When oil is smeared around a jewel, okay, it creates what's known as a capillary pathway, which allows the oil to creep away from the pivot over time. When you have loose oil that's not being held by capillary action, oil is going to migrate across the flat surfaces of the jewel to the surrounding plate, and it's just going to contaminate all kinds of parts. Oil that's out of place is instantly going to attract dust and debris. The moment you open a lubricated movement, any dust that's in the environment can settle on that exposed oil. If you look at it under magnification, you can see that any oil parts immediately start collecting tiny bits of dust and other debris when it's exposed to the air. If you don't reclean these parts and you just put the watch back together, what you're effectively doing is trapping those contaminants inside the jewel holes. Without the proper lubrication in place, the friction between the steel pivot and the jewel rises dramatically. And as we know, we want to do everything not to hamper amplitude, right? Not only does it affect amplitude, but it also increases wear and tear. Now, if you're just working on an NH35 or something like that, easy to replace parts. But this can become a big problem, especially if you're servicing a vintage movement with hard to find parts, which eventually is going to lead to some very expensive repairs in the future. And maybe one of the biggest issues is that a movement that's reassembled without proper lubrication is often going to display performance issues. You might see lower balance amplitude or fluctuating amplitude or erratic rates. And in some extreme cases, the movement will stop intermittently. Now, some people will just try to add a bit more oil without cleaning anything first. But what this does is it creates an excess of oil that floods the movement, and that often ends up in the escapement or the hairspring, and that's going to cause serious problems. If you have any problem that requires a disassembly or a partial disassembly after you've done the oiling, the safest procedure is to do a final clean of those parts again before reassembling and relubricating. And please remember, you're always better off developing good habits right from the start, which will save you a lot of time and frustration. It's actually going to be less work in the long run by recleaning and lubricating the parts. Since a watch that has been recleaned and oiled is not going to interfere with your troubleshooting a problem, whereas just taking shortcuts will always add a new layer or a new problem to the movement. And that just complicates troubleshooting. And because there's so much more to learn, I hope to see you in the next video.